June 29th, 2022 meeting of the Oahu Real Property Tax Advisory Commission to order. This time, public testimony pursuant to Act 220 Session Laws of Hawaii 2021 in order to allow public participation in a manner consistent with social distancing practices. The following procedures are in effect for the meeting. Members of the public are welcome to be present in the meeting room and may view the meeting on a live broadcast via the WebEx internet platform or via recording once available on the Commission's website. Testimony will be accepted on all items in person and virtually via video conference or phone following opening remarks and administrative announcements. If you would like to present oral testimony remotely, please log in through the WebEx internet platform for meeting number 2495-899-7428 with password ORPTAC-62922. Written testimonies, including the testifier's address, email address, and phone number, will be available to the public on the Commission's website. As a courtesy, please turn off all cell phones for the duration of the meeting. Commission Aide George White, would you please call the roll to confirm the attendance of commissioners at this meeting and the presence of a quorum?
Yes, Chair. Commissioner Mould is excused. Vice Chair, Acting Chair Wong.
Present virtually.
Commissioner Bean.
Present virtually.
Commissioner Legal.
Present virtually.
Commissioner Peters.
Present in person.
Commissioner Pham.
Present virtual.
And Commissioner Stormo Gibson.
Can people all hear me?
We can hear you. And Commissioner Stormo Gibson is present virtually. Chair, you have a quorum.
Right.
All quorum present.
The few, the proud, the tax nerds. Good to
Given
good
the
to see other
presence of
people
a
who care about
quorum,
taxes.
let us continue on with our agenda and the business of the Commission. Commissioners, pursuant to the Act 220, the meeting will automatically recess if we lose audio-visual contact.
Is on today.
Oh. All right. Commissioners, pursuant to the Act 220, the meeting will automatically recess if we lose audio-visual contact with you and cannot reconvene until we reestablish contact. Therefore, please announce beforehand if you will be voluntarily signing out of the meeting. At this point, we now will proceed to the agenda and to testifiers. To those coming in remotely, please video conference from a quiet location. Also, be sure that your microphones and camera are in working order. For those joining us by phone, we will identify you by your phone prefix. If technical issues arise, I will give you a few moments to try to resolve minor connection issues. However, if it cannot be resolved, I will have to move on to the next testifier. When I call your name, please state your full name and the agenda item or items that you are testifying on. Speakers are limited to a 2-minute presentation for each item. When the timer goes off, please conclude your remarks promptly. I will close testimony once all speakers have testified. Commission Aide White, are there persons present virtually or in person who wish to testify?
Yes, Chair. First, there are no persons present in person to testify, but for the record, the commissioners have been provided written testimony, and I'll briefly identify those individuals, and those testimonies have been logged with the clerk. Testimony from former Commissioner Natalie Iwasa, the Honolulu Fire Department Federal Credit Union, the Hawaii Credit Union League, as well as an individual named Randall Hugh. And we also received testimony, follow-up testimony from former Commissioner Iwasa, as well as representatives of the McKinley Car Wash in Kaka'ako, the Car Store Incorporated in Kaka'ako, and we also received a formal communication from Council Member Tanaka related to Bill 34, Ordinance 16-21 regarding exemptions in Kaka'ako. Turning to virtual testifiers, there's a handful of individuals that have signed on. Audrey Suga Nakagawa, are you here to testify or just monitor?
I'm here just to monitor. Thank you.
Thank you. Brandon Sakia, are you here to provide testimony or just to monitor?
He doesn't have a mic. He's with Councilmember Say's office, and
Thank
I
you
am
very
too,
much.
just monitoring.
If Director Lopez from AARP Hawaii is ready and available, I believe she is present to testify, and if she's prepared, we can proceed with her testimony.
I'm actually here just to observe as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Director. Paula Sugimoto Matsushima. Ms. Sumimoto Matsushima, are you present? Just observing, thank you, I received a note. And I believe that Ms. Stephanie Sakamoto also indicated that she would just be observing. She provided written testimony on behalf of two credit unions as noted earlier, and also acknowledged the presence of Administrator Stephen Takara from the Real Property Assessment Division of the city. So Chair, there are no additional virtual testifiers.
Sorry, this is Stephanie Sakamoto. Carol Marks from the Hawaii Credit Union League is here to testify on our behalf.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sakamoto. Ms. Marks, thank you for your patience, and please proceed with your testimony.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Aloha, my name is Carol Marks, and I'm testifying for the credit unions to keep the real property tax exemption left intact. I took on my new role as president of the Hawaii Credit Union League on April 18th of this year, and I have 30 years of experience in branch banking and mortgage banking. Plus, I've been a credit union member since I was a child. Both my parents come from humble roots. My dad grew up on a sugar plantation camp in Hilo. My mom was a Farrington graduate. And I've had the benefit of watching my parents work hard, pay rent on that 600 square foot home of ours in Kaimuki, and they finally bought their first townhouse in leasehold tenure in their 50s. I believe credit unions can continue to impact the financial well-being of low-income people like my folks and the underserved communities. So thanks for your consideration of that. What we see in business is a gravitational pull towards where the greatest demand and revenue is for success. However, in the nonprofit world, like for credit unions, it's different. Instead, the focus is on the members they serve. Fortunately, we have 48 credit unions in Hawaii, 26 on Oahu, and 52% of them are small, less than 100 million in assets, 100 million assets. But they play a big role on their members' financial well-being because they often lend to members whose credit rating is lacking or absent. Those members would not be able to get an auto loan to get to work or possibly miss a rent payment because they lack credit. And because real life happens, the folks lose their jobs, family members pass away. And on happier notes, there's birth and marriages, but that allows for adjustments to finances. So these are the non-advertised stories of the credit union's mission, people helping people, and why 71% of Hawaii's credit unions serve low-income areas and those most in need. As a nonprofit organization, the 26 Oahu credit unions can continue that mission, give inspiration to their children, and work hard to earn a fair wage and contribute to the community. Besides this testimony, I appreciate the time you took to read the testimonials from the Honolulu Fire Federal Credit Union and Aloha Pacific Federal Credit Union. So on behalf of the Hawaii Credit Union League and the Oahu Credit Union, Ohana, thank you for your time and consideration. Mahalo and aloha.
Thank you, Ms. Marks. Are there any questions from the Commission for Ms. Marks? Commissioner Pham.
Thank you. Ms. Marks, in your testimony, you're talking about the service to low-income communities. Can you explain the nature of the credit union real property and where it's located? Are they located predominantly in underserved areas? What is the nature of the locations and the real property of the credit unions?
So they are a lot of credit unions in Hawaii as compared to other states. And it's because we are an island community. And because of that, many of those are one building type of credit unions that have that property that they own, but that's, all they had. And some of them, came from the plantation era. So that's where the remoteness of their existence occurs. There are some credit unions that actually rent the properties that they exist in. And many of them, though, own the land that they already are and have been for many years, 75 plus years for some of them. Does that answer your question? I hope that helps.
This is Commissioner Peters. I have a question. Credit unions have been around for a long time. Like you said, you were a member even as a child, I guess, for your parents. When I was growing up, it seemed like credit unions, you could become a member based on where you worked. Like if you worked for Hawaiian Electric, they had a credit union, right? If you were for Hawaiian Telephone, they had, and it was basically where you worked. It seems in today's world, especially in Hawaii, it seems like they pretty much open it up to just about everybody. And I guess that's why it seems so competitive. That's why you see so much TV advertising. I'm thinking maybe it's possibly because back in the 80s, the savings and loan industry went out, and I think the credit unions have been kind of stepping in and trying to fill that void. But it seems like the credit unions of 75 years ago or even 30 years ago are very different today. Would you agree with that?
I think what you see are the exception, because most of the credit unions are small in comparison to the community banks that are, over 6 billion in size. Most of the credit unions are very small, and they still serve a field of membership which is restricted, but some of it is more open. And the cause of that is just to survive in the competitive world of the financial industry, but really to still serve their primary member. And I think the zip codes will show that they still do that, serve the primary member and their families.
But there are a lot of credit unions that are pretty much island-wide now. They have branches all over.
I don't know the exact percentage, but there are a few that are island-wide. Again, they still are pretty diminished in comparison to the larger community banks. And the large community banks are such that even they don't have the competitor of the national banks because our markets are so small. So the credit unions are primarily staying in place in the remote areas to serve those underserved communities, because just like a Bank of America does not want to open business and lose money in Hawaii, some of the community banks don't want to stay in the further remote areas and have to pay for, rental properties or, pay for the real property there, because it's hard to exist. So the credit unions kind of fill that role of serving those remote and underserved populations.
Mr. Chair, I have a question. This is Jack Legal.
Commissioner.
Thank you, Carol, for coming over and giving your testimony. You certainly are enjoying the best of two worlds, having been in a commercial banking, and now you are with the credit unions. And we certainly hear about this on TV, newspapers, and everything about competition. How are they faring competing with commercial banking, the credit unions? for members, for credits, loans, whatever, everything.
So I've been in my role, I think this is my 9th or 10th week. I don't have all the stats, but I can say that our national research from the Credit Union National Association will say that we still have a small percent of the total business of commerce in the financial industry because the larger community banks have just bigger resources than the credit unions have. But if you were to compare them on an account for account basis, what the credit card rate is versus what a bank or a competitor's rate is, our rates are lower, our fees are less. So the products that we offer are at a lower rate for the credit union members, or if it's a savings, it's at a higher rate. That is the research that shows for credit unions versus banks. As far as surviving and competing, as I mentioned, I don't have the exact percentage, but it is still low in comparison to the market share that Bank of Hawaii or First Hawaiian Bank holds because of their scalability with their online and massive mortgage underwriting and processing operations. The credit unions are, usually much smaller in comparison. Does that help you? Thanks, Jack, for your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you.
Marks, if I'm just correct in understanding the structure of credit unions is that they pass on their savings in a form of higher interest rates for savings accounts and lower interest rates for loans. And these are benefits, monetary benefits that really go to the members of the credit union. And that's as a result of the nonprofit status and the nonprofit organization. These credit unions don't have to pursue a profit motive, but instead of having that top layer go to profits, it goes to the members, correct?
That's correct. The other thing that is often unseen is where they will take on a little bit more risk for the member by way of helping the member establish credit. And so they have to, prepare for potential loan loss reserves, but they're willing to give a hand to the credit union members, maybe their children who are just getting started. And they often do loans for members that don't have the A paper or the best credit ratings, say for automobile or even for mortgages or home equity lines. They try to do it in a make sense type of lending situation because the members are the owners of the credit unions. And that's the difference in how the voluntary board of directors view their lending practices or their dividend returns. And that's just the way that they make a difference for their community.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, do credit unions, and I'm not familiar, do they receive any type of federal assurance or any type of federal aid or state aid for that matter in return for taking on higher risk types of clients and for the outreach to these sort of underrepresented or underserved communities?
That's a really great question. So there is the Department of Treasury, along with other financial institutions that can apply for CDFI status. And through that, they can get some grant approvals that help their credit unions. What they do to provide to the Department of Treasury in those CDFI grants is they provide evidence of the low income type of lending they do. And, basically that evidence is that they're truly helping this underserved community and therefore they get grant funding in that regards.
And is that CDFI fund, is that exclusively for credit unions or to all financial institutions?
It's to all financial institutions.
Okay,
Mhm.
Mr. Chair, can I just follow up to your question?
Absolutely.
Do you have any percentage as to how many are taking advantage of the CDFI in the credit union world?
Okay, so this is my third month on the job, but I could do some follow-up research if you so require. I would definitely would put that on the list of the requests. One thing that I would like to endeavor to do is get more of the credit union CDFI certified. Many don't do it because it takes a lot of resources from their small credit union operations. But together we can endeavor to get more CDFI status. Hawaii has the benefit of being a minority depository institution status with the National Credit Union Association, so that also provides more benefits to our members. And I think that's why it's important that we keep the credit unions strong and intact and able to serve the members as best they can, because our members can't drive to another state, like, you know, in the upper 48. And so that's why I think the credit unions have, you know, stayed intact. And it's been a struggle for many because there used to be over 100 credit unions in the past. And just due to survivability, some of the larger credit unions have had to take on mergers, some which they didn't want to do, but at the behest of the NCUA, they have. And so it's not all about just trying to be the biggest and the best. It's just trying to help the brethren, smaller credit unions stay intact.
I have one more question for Ms. Marks. So you get a property tax exemption from the city. Do you get any other tax exemptions from other levels of government, like the state, federal government?
Perhaps, can you restate that again?
Do you get any other tax exemptions besides the property tax exemption that we're discussing today?
We're a nonprofit, so all the nonprofit tax exemptions we enjoy, the credit union organizations do enjoy. So yes. I think Kenna has a question.
Yes, Anna, let me get rid of this annoying icon now. So first of all, I'm going to be a little bit of devil's advocate, although I myself am a credit union member. I use USAA for most of my banking. So I'm very much a fan of credit unions. But from a tax policy perspective, you know, the concept is if we all chip in a little bit to a pot, such as property taxes, then we can redirect those funds towards where the city has the greatest needs, right? So you have to just, from a tax perspective, the more exemptions that are given out, the less people that are contributing to the pot. And so there's, you know, that's the downside of any exemption, really. So I wanted to just think about impact, because what I saw from the testimony is the average member impact would be $6 a month or $74 a year. Is that right?
I haven't done the math on that, Kenna. I just wanted to note that we're one of many nonprofit institutions in Hawaii, credit unions, and we just ask to be treated as other nonprofits that are exempt from paying those real property taxes. So,
because I guess my only pushback here is the more exemptions you grant to anybody, the less money the public has that can be directed, right? Because like I'm part of USAA, would I love to get a $6 discount a month? Sure, why not? But at the same time, if some of those tax monies are going towards, funding important goods and services, then, there's a trade-off, right? So I'm not picking on a credit union in particular. I'm saying, all nonprofits, actually, we have to really be mindful of, is it worth the trade-off of chipping away at that public resource? So that's what I guess, is the $6 per month discount for members, is that really going to make a difference in terms of someone joining the credit union or not, would be my question.
I'm not an expert in that arena on what would be the best way to proceed, except that I do know that it would take away from the benefits of the members. So taxing the credit union organizations is like putting additional tax on the members. And they're the most in need, and to many of them, $6 might mean a lot. I can't say, and I don't know if that's an average. So I appreciate the question, but we're just here to support our members and continue to provide thrift to those remote areas that we do.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Commissioner Pham has a question.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Commissioner Stormy Gibson regarding the nonprofit exemption. One thing that the commission has already discussed is the charitable nonprofit exemption, and making sure that the rules on that get tightened up to be defined as a 501c3, which credit unions are not. But how would you compare the mission of a credit union to that of a 501c3 charitable organization?
I would probably have to do more research to, appropriately respond. For the larger part of my career, has been in community banking and mortgage banking. And so I'd like to respond. I don't want to say anything incorrect. I guess I can just reflect on the fact that since April 18th, in the last 10 weeks or so, I've tried to visit as many of the credit unions as I have, and I do see the stark difference in the role they play. I want to say, and this is not factual, but I think conjecturally, I hear that the staff is not as highly paid as maybe some of the other financial institutions. So in a way, there's this cooperative spirit that goes on from, the teller to the manager. So just like nonprofits, who some of the executives don't get paid a lot, and the mission is just to serve their purpose. I think the purpose of people, helping the community, get on their feet and keep going. That's the plantation mentality that the credit unions in Hawaii many of them are born from. Some are, employer organizations like Jack or somebody mentioned the Hawaiian Electric employees. But most of the credit unions were from coffee farms, sugar plantation. The first credit union was a Big Island Teachers Credit Union, 7 immigrants that couldn't get credit back then. They had to put in their own money to start a credit union. So it's different from just the other nonprofit purpose. I think in this situation, they were just trying to help each other get by, just like in Japanese, they call it tanimoshi, when a community will put in money, build a house, and then they put in money, build the next neighbor's house. It's that cooperative spirit of credit unions that I think we aim to keep intact. And So I'm sorry, Commissioner Pham, I can't really do the comparison yet, but I hope that helps a little.
Thank you.
Thank you for so much of your time. I appreciate it, and for reading all the testimony. I know there's much to consider for all of the Oahu, but
Is there any other testimony? I mean, any other questions or comments for Ms. Marks?
Chair Wong, if Budget Chair Say wishes to ask a question, is that all right?
Of course.
Okay, this is for Carol, and the simple point for me is, can you research for us what percentage of the membership of credit union members are homeowners?
I cannot at this time. Yeah.
Because
unfortunately, I don't have that number. Yeah.
Yeah, just going back to Kenna's position, you know, at the end of the day, we have to find the resources to pay for government county services. And if your exemption is on the books, I'm not supporting your membership if they ask me to increase the homeowners exemption for 65 and above. You know, there's a trade-off that I have to make in balancing the county's budget. And it's a concern because of what is happening throughout the world and also on the national level and the state level. Yes, you know, property taxes are very stable, but I was talking to some of my friends, I think you won't see any decrease in real property taxes, but you won't see any increases next year in real property tax valuation because of the high interest rates by the Federal Reserve Board and other external factors that are contributing to it as far as investment in Hawaii. I just really wanted to see that we try to address all of these exemptions. And for me, Carol, I can understand your thinking, but we're not in the plantation mentality. There is no plantation today. Accessibility should be there for all residents of the respective 4 counties. And the only reason why I think now the big banks are pulling back is because they're going all electronic. That's why I'm just trying to figure out, okay, if you guys don't want us to repeal the real property tax exemptions for credit unions, the other question was, how did the state credit union acquire that big property or building? That was through profits, right?
Thank you for your question and for your comments. But I can't tell you all of the information on the other question regarding the state credit union. But yeah, thank you.
All I'm saying is if they can buy more and more real estate and increasing your inventory as far as your assets, why should you not pay property taxes?
Yeah.
You're making money.
Maybe
you don't have to respond. I'm just bringing it up because I gotta get it out of my system.
No, thank you for your question. Maybe I can call on Stephanie Sakamoto. She might have more background that can help with your question.
Sorry, speaker, your initial question was how many credit union members are homeowners, yeah?
Correct.
Is that your initial question? Okay. That's something we can definitely look into. I can get back to you on that. With regards
to if I could lower just the devaluation of the increase in the values of real property tax, that would benefit the members also, which is a city and county responsibility. Am I not correct? That's why I'm trying to find out if we have 100 members and 78% of them are homeowners. The exemption for the nonprofit benefits the members, but it also affects the members also, because I don't think I can lower the valuation if I need to pay the bills that I have to pay as we move forward. So like as an example, for the county of, for the 4 counties, correct me if I'm wrong, don't we have a 4-year contract on collective bargaining? How am I gonna pay that based on the present valuation of 2022? When 2023, 2024, our contribution to the salaries will be increasing. And that's the dilemma I think a lot of councils face today. And what we do is just pass it on to the resort condominium guys. But for the local residents, we're not gonna even try to touch the rates, which is for Oahu, $350 per thousand. That's the discussion I think we all need, because we're looking at other variables or other alternatives in trying to generate some income to pay our county services. And for me, that was just one of them as far as exemptions and credits. But thank you for your thoughts. Okay, Steph.
Thank you, Speaker. We can definitely talk about this more going forward. We're definitely more than happy to work with the commission or with the council moving forward. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Is there any further testimony or comment for these 2 testifiers, for Ms. Sakamoto and Ms. Marks?
Chair Wong, I believe Director Lopez from AARP Hawaii has her hand raised.
Okay, Ms. Lopez, proceed.
Thank you. I'm not sure this is appropriate per se, but appreciate the question. So I don't know if you normally have people who aren't testifying chiming in on the issue. I heard Commissioner Pham mention that the commission was looking at narrowing the exemption to solely 501c3s. And I guess my question is, does the commission understand, how many other organizations out there fall outside of that 501c3 status, and the degree to which those organizations that would be impacted from this narrowing, do they understand that it could affect their tax exemption issues? That was just a question that came to my mind, because there are organizations that, because they engage in advocacy or lobbying or legislative types of lobbying, they are not 501c3s for that purpose. And so just trying to understand, I'm trying to think of all the organizations out there that are somewhat nonprofit, that own property, and the degree to which those organizations are aware of what the commission's intentions are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lopez. I think that was a really good comment, and I think that we're prepared to address that with the exemptions that we're going to talk about. For now, I'd like to keep us right onto the federal credit or the credit union topic, just to keep us on point. But I do believe that we will be discussing this, and I think Commissioner Pham can expand on that. If not him, then I will, because we have discussed this in detail. I just want to make sure that
Thank you.
Ms. Sakamoto and Ms. Marks, that if they don't plan to be on any further, that we don't keep them on the line. So, are there any additional questions or comments relating to the credit union's exemption for Ms. Sakamoto or Ms. Marks? There being no further comment on this, is there any other? Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Marks, Ms. Sakamoto. Is there any other testimony, Commissioner Aide White?
No, Chair.
Great, thank you. There being no other testifiers, testimony is now closed. I do invite those who are on either monitoring or spectating to continue to remain on the line if possible. We may have questions, so the commission is going to discuss a lot of these things, and that if questions do come up and you're still on the line, I invite the commissioners to ask for additional comments and input as deemed necessary. Members, turning to item 1 for action on the agenda, we have 5 exemptions that have been deferred from prior meetings for further discussions. With your indulgence, I propose that we take item 1 in reverse order to gain some momentum, and then start with the exemptions pertaining to historic properties, childcare, and agricultural improvements. Without objection, turning first to item 1E, the exemption for dedicated historic properties pursuant to ROH sections 810.22 and 810.30. As it currently stands, the Commission's approved a recommendation to readopt the 2019 Commission's recommendation, increasing the minimum real property tax on fully exempt properties from $300 to $1,000, and partially exempt properties subject to a real property tax no less than $1,000. Commissioners did express a desire to revisit these exemptions, though, and discuss whether any further amendments, including increasing the proposed minimum real property tax, would be worthwhile. At this time, the floor is open to discussion. Okay, as I recall, our discussions focused on the dedicated historic properties noted that the real property tax has not been increased in the recent past, or the exemption. The fully exempt properties have an exemption, but their baseline tax has not been increased. So that's where we stand right now on whether to increase the baseline tax for these properties.
So Chair, this is Jack Legal. I just have a question, maybe a clarification as well. As I recall, the REPD, or they normally inspect these properties, right?
That's correct.
They're open to inspection. Do they keep like a tab as to how these homeowners, occupants treat these properties?
Based on my memory, these properties have to apply through a National Historic Database or it's through another application. It's not directly with RPAD, but they are monitored by another agency, and then RPAD relies on that certification.
Okay. The reason I ask, Mr. Chair, is if we have that kind of a data that some of these properties are not maintained, or they just kind of enjoying their stay in that house, that I think I can probably get a very educated vote that we should increase to $1,000. I mean, that's just my what I think. That's the reason I asked that question.
Thank you, Commissioner Lebo. Was there another comment? I thought I heard somebody.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that keeping a flat rate that doesn't keep up with inflation is always counterproductive from the standpoint of providing services, right? Because $300 today is not the same as $300 20 years ago or 10 years ago. So I think anytime you are not keeping up, at least with inflation, you are essentially decreasing the budget to pay for services. And it just doesn't seem like all of the services the county should be providing has sufficient resources. So giving people a tax break year after year doesn't make a lot of sense as an organization, right? So I think that, anyway, I fully support making sure revenues keep pace with inflation at the minimum, and definitely $1,000 a year is a very, very minimal tax.
Pham?
I took this one back and I actually researched a few of the properties and walked to them and tried to observe them and think about myself as just a member of the general public. And I actually just don't see a purpose in having these exemptions. While these are very nice to look at properties, I didn't see the public benefit. You can see them from the public right of way, but you can enjoy architecture, for example, of other buildings that are not deemed historic. And I would actually be in favor of recommending that these exemptions be repealed, and putting that to the council for consideration, and then allowing the owners of those historic properties to have to act on that at the city council hearings and justify what the public benefit is for having these exemptions.
Commissioner Bean, if I could just make a comment. In addition, as I reviewed some of the, as I reviewed the ROH, it didn't appear that there was a financial qualification as well. And so some of the homes on this register are owned by people who don't, who don't seem to have a financial need to have this exemption. And so that's another issue that I have with it.
Mr. Chair, I was just thinking, Commissioner Pham's suggestion is pretty good, but so if we take off their exemption, in other words, we don't really have any, do we still have control over these buildings? As of now, I think they cannot be sold, I think, or renovated to something. So if we have no more control over these buildings, can they be demolished and then build a new one, these properties?
I think it's just as a general matter, the purpose and the policy behind this exemption was to preserve buildings that are part of the history of the county. And I think that, as with all things involving beauty, it is in the eye of the beholder, right? The type of value that one places on a historic property may vary from one person to the other. Perhaps Commissioner Pham has an appreciation for more modern type buildings, or perhaps somebody who wrote this law has an appreciation for old style plantation homes. I think that really is a subjective matter. Just to play devil's advocate a bit, I think that the city council had a clear policy when it adopted this exemption, that it was to preserve the historical nature of certain buildings and to preserve the feel of Hawaii from certain places in time. And that was deemed to be worth the cost of the exemption. Maybe that cost has changed, or maybe that cost, it really doesn't justify the policy anymore. My own personal feeling is that I think that there is some value to historic buildings. I think that they are what make Hawaii special. If you go visit, for instance, San Francisco, you get to see the row houses there, and that's iconic. If you go to see houses, in the Northeast, you've got these old cottages, and if you go to the South, you've got these bungalows. And in Hawaii, we've got our own styles of architecture that have long been in existence. And I think that does make Hawaii special. And that doesn't mean that we should exempt these property owners from tax, not at all, but I think they should pay something. But I think there is some type of value that the council decided on a long time ago, and I think that's still there. But I'm in favor of increasing the minimum property tax, but not outright eliminating it. Open to other comments.
Mr. Chair, I'm actually in favor of raising the 1,000. But I think you said it well. I think beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And also the key word there, I think, is preservation, because as to what's going on around Hawaii now, we're building all these monsters homes, tearing down old buildings and building all these big homes. So we don't want to do that. I think we want to preserve something that is kind of historical into the history of Hawaii. And I think some of them may not be beautiful, but there's a history behind that house, why it's there. So I'm actually in favor of just raising it $1,000. little by little, it's step by step,
Any comment from those attending in person?
A lot of work we have to this.
I think Kenna has a comment,
I wanted to add just one other perspective from, a tax policy perspective, right? Which is sometimes we use taxes. I mean, so we need to have taxes to pay for public goods and services, right? Like that's the point. And in particular, goods and services that no one else is going to pay for. Like no one else is going to pay for housing for homeless people or, healthcare needs or fixing the roads. Like generally, we have to have a government to help pay for these things. And so sometimes you use taxes to incentivize behavior. Like, hey, if you do this, we'll give you a discount, right? So, hey, if you buy your own home, we'll give you a homeowner's discount. We want to promote that goal. So that's like, we give discounts to solar operators because we want to promote it. But sometimes the discount loses value and isn't like, it's not needed, right? So we don't tend to give a discount to, I don't know, like having cars put on seatbelts because it's just like mandatory. So my point is, we're giving a discount to these historic properties. If we remove the discount, will we end up with less historic properties? What will be what's the downside of removing it? Is that incentive needed to keep these properties? That's what I'm not sure about, because, for example, the row houses in San Francisco, they don't get a discount for being a row house. Most places, it's very few and limited, the properties that they feel like need a discount in order to maybe pay for maintenance. So my question is this discount needed to preserve these properties in some way? Because otherwise, what would happen? Yeah.
That's a good point. And it's interesting that you brought up how we talk about the government's need to spend money to provide for public goods and services. And I think that looking at historic properties, it's not something the government really is in the business of providing. I don't think the government's in the business of acquiring historic properties and making sure that they are, remain standing and that they're not redeveloped. That's not really something in their business. I think to the extent that happens, it's usually done by private individuals, those who see worth in the homes and the structures, and they want to keep them standing. And this is our way of doing that. And I think that, it's an appropriate incentive, and that I don't know if we need it. That really is I guess needs all change based on how much money we have available, right? But I think that's for all of us to decide and to gauge. But I think there hasn't been a lot of testimony from the community on this. I think that we should vote on this as a commission to get a recommendation out, to not hold on to it any longer. There are no other objections. Great. Just this will be real informal. Just by a raise of hands, all those in favor of maintaining the exemption as is, would you please raise your hand just to get a quick count? Commissioner White, can you make a count for us, please?
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Maintaining as is, meaning $300?
Yes, maintaining the statute as is.
Okay.
There are no, Commissioner Stormo Gibson, is your hand raised or not raised? No, there are no hands raised, Chair.
Okay. Will anybody in favor of the Commission's standing recommendation to increase the minimum property tax on properties from $300 to $1,000 and partially exempt properties to that amount no less than $1,000 as recommended in our prior discussions? Those in favor, please raise your hands.
Can we be in
With-
favor of
Question.
eliminating it
choose
and
this,
in favor of
that means-
increasing?
I will get there. That's the next option is the elimination of the exemption altogether. So those specifically in favor of the prior recommendation as written, please raise your hand at this time. This does not include those in favor of eliminating the exemption altogether.
And we have 2 hands raised as proposed by you, Chair. So Chair Wong and Commissioner Legal regarding maintaining the Commission's existing recommendation to amend the threshold to 1,000.
Thank you, Commissioner White. And at this time, those in favor of eliminating the exemption altogether, please raise your hands.
And we have 3 hands raised. I believe Commissioner Bean may be abstaining, but other than that.
Only because I think that I would support another option, which would be to raise it with some caveats. I mean, I think that any kind of exemption at this point should be tied to ability of the owner to pay a tax.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who are homesteaders, for instance, who have no ability to even the increase to $1,000 may be difficult for them. But there are other people, and I have looked at some of the historic homes, have more than enough ability to pay. And I don't think that the exemption should be across the board. So.
Okay. Well, it looks
If
like
we're
nobody
taking a
wants
vote.
nobody wants to keep the exemption as it stands on the books, so we can cross that off of our list.
And maybe our report could just note these different options that have come up.
I think that's certainly a possibility. We can. I think that unanimously we can agree that as written, that the owners of historic properties do not appear to be paying, for lack of better words, their fair share. As it currently stands, the exemption is a bit too generous. The commission is in favor of either an increase in the minimum property tax on these properties, or an altogether removal of the exemption. But the commission does see this as an action item for the city council to take on in future bills. It is something that they should need to look at. I think that would cover all of our concerns here. With Commissioner Bean, we could even include a sentence in there discussing the monitoring of these properties, and maybe including a certain need base, or the types of homeowners that will qualify, or the property owners that qualify for this exemption altogether. But I think that simply saying this needs to be looked at, and at the very least the amount needs to be increased, the minimum amounts paid need to be increased. I think that includes all of our thoughts on this. Is there any comment there?
I just wanted to ask Commissioner Bean because it makes sense your concern about very low income people, would they be impacted? And I'm wondering if that concern would be addressed at all by the circuit breaker, because I believe Honolulu has one where if a property tax of any sort is more than, I think it's 3% of your income, then you're exempted from anything over that, right?
True.
Would that address the concern about impacting low income folks?
I think to a certain extent it does.
Okay, and I just wanted to double check about that circuit breaker. I'm pretty sure that that's in place in Honolulu.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
The threshold is $60,000 of annual income.
Okay. So if you earn less than 60 grand your taxes cannot be more than 3% of your income. Is that right? Something like that.
That works out.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Commissioners, based on this discussion, my recommendation here is a motion. I move to amend the prior commission's prior recommendation, or I guess its current recommendation, to include the option that the city council examine the elimination of the dedicated historic properties exemption. And I believe that this motion will allow for all of our discussions to be included and all of our thoughts to be considered by the city council. And it also requests action on this, which I think we're in unanimous agreement based on our hand showing.
You need a second with your motion, Mr. Chair?
Yes, is there a second?
A second, yeah. A second motion.
Thank you, Commissioner Legal. Members, are there any discussion as to the motion?
Just to clarify, that recommendation from the commission would then read something to the extent of elimination or raising the minimum to 1,000, and then an additional sentence regarding a need-based qualification.
That is my understanding. Absent objection to the motion, do we have unanimous consent to approve this amended recommendation as discussed?
No objection.
With unanimous consent, motion approved, so ordered. Thank you. Members, now turning to item 1D, the group for-profit childcare exemption under ROH section 8-10.33. The 2019 Commission recommended this exemption be repealed, and this Commission deferred the matter for further discussion, which Commissioner Pham and myself can start off. Commissioner Pham, I know that you and I had differing opinions, so I'll let you take the floor first.
Thank you, Commissioner Wong. Yes, I think that regarding this exemption, the previous commissions, you rightfully pointed out, this is a for-profit exemption, and that's not something that we see elsewhere throughout the ordinance. So there were comparisons to nonprofits, and if you are a nonprofit childcare center, then you can currently claim the exemption under a charitable purposes exemption, and then even under the Commission's current recommendation to tighten that to 501c3s only, there would still be a qualification there. I know that there were concerns that this exemption would affect sort of your mom and pop type operation for childcare, but the way that it reads, it's really about group childcare centers. So these are businesses, and if they're businesses, then they need to be taxed as such. Now, if the city and county, if our community wants to increase the supply of group childcare centers or to improve affordability of childcare services, I think there are other ways than going through the property tax exemptions to help support that goal. That there are ways to offer credits or other programs, grants to the actual parents and guardians of children who need the childcare, or to the service providers themselves, but not through property tax exemptions. So I think while it is a noble goal to want to have affordable childcare in our community, I don't think that keeping this here in the property tax exemptions is the right way to go about accomplishing that goal.
Thank you, Commissioner Pham. Any other comment from the commissioners? There being none, I have a few comments of my own. I think at the time that this exemption was contemplated, as well as now, there is a shortage of childcare in the county. And I don't think that's disputed by anybody. It hasn't been by the commissioners or testimony yet, although that may happen. But there is a shortage of childcare options. The focus on whether or not a group childcare center is a nonprofit or a for-profit shouldn't matter at a time when there is a shortage and we seek to encourage more childcare providers. Now, there are other ways that Commissioner Pham suggests that this can be accomplished by credits or grants to the parents of children, but I don't see this as increasing the supply. This would simply increase the shortage by giving more parents the ability to pay for childcare without increasing the number of childcare providers. Giving these credits or grants to the programs themselves, it could happen, it could help, but I think that the real property tax exemption is one of the more effective and efficient ways of doing this. Instead of having the programs apply for grants or credits beforehand, I think the property, when you establish a child care center or a group child care center, is going to be one of your biggest concerns of whether or not we can acquire this property to have kids on it and whether or not we can afford to maintain it. And this exemption cuts right to the chase. It gives them relief on their property tax bill in a way that a grant or a credit, any type of application, would be infinitely more complex. This is something that helps to solve the problem. It does increase relief for for-profit businesses, but I think that a business, just because it operates for a profit, if it provides something that we desperately need, isn't something that we should hold it against. For instance, I don't think anybody would suggest raising more taxes on items where there's a shortage. And that's exactly what we have here, making them more expensive and making them harder to come by or harder to maintain or harder to acquire for the public is something that I think goes against the logic that we had when we adopted this exemption, and it goes against logic now. So I would vote to maintain the exemption. Commissioner Stormer Gibson.
Yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying about making people apply for a grant would be added paperwork and maybe not as practical. I just wonder to what extent the childcare shortage is impacted by, you know, a few $1,000s a year property tax exemption, and give that exemption. Does that translate to higher worker wages? Like, my guess is the reason we have a shortage is that workers are not paid enough to provide childcare. Places that do not have a shortage of childcare workers, generally it's because there's a government program that pays them well. That's how people solve the childcare shortage. So we just don't know when a company gets a break, you know, what do they do with that few $1,000s break that they get? That's, yeah. So maybe it's okay to leave it, because in some instances that does get passed on to higher wages. It could be, but we don't know for sure. And so I don't know that there's such a direct link to, hey, we gave you a tax break, so now you're going to be able to keep your workers more. We don't know, but maybe.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Jack Legal.
Yes.
I don't have any children like you. You just have your own child, I think, you know. So, do the for-profit childcare, do they charge more than the nonprofit? I mean, what is the competition there? Is there a competition between the two?
Yes, there is competition. The group childcare centers, the ones that are for-profit, in my experience, do charge higher amounts than those that are nonprofit. But the way that I look at it is that every parent who is willing to pay or can pay to put their kid in a for-profit childcare center, that's one more space that opens up at a nonprofit center. Just the number of spots available, just by increasing the number of spots, that's how you address a shortage. And And to me, the price difference, if you can pay to ensure that your child can go to a for-profit child care center, and if that's the difference between you going to work and not, you're going to make that decision. You're going to do it. So long as there's a spot anywhere you can get it, then that's been my experience. We were on the waiting list for almost 3 or 4 different child care centers. We had to put in our we had to put in our enrollment at one of the for-profit childcare centers before a nonprofit spot opened up that we were able to get into. But it does, yeah, they do go quickly, and that's the more spots that are available, the more options people are going to have.
So it seems to me that giving tax breaks to for-profit childcare is more like an incentive, to have more childcare centers around Hawaii, and
right,
giving a lot of options to parents. Like if the nonprofit is so full, you have nowhere to go. So you got to incentivize this for-profit childcare so that they'll open more and more.
Commissioner Stormer Gibson.
I appreciate Commissioner Legal's framing of it. It's a form of incentive for people to open childcare centers, and I would support that framing. But I would also just want to add in the report that this is an imperfect incentive. We don't know how much of it goes towards actually rising wages, and so this is really just a Band-Aid attempt to increase childcare centers, and which is maybe a good thing. But I would want to add that the real solution to access to childcare, which I think is a huge policy goal, is to actually have a government-funded program. Places that ensure quality access to all parents, they have government-funded programs. So I just want to be clear to what extent this attempt is more of a stopgap around the edges kind of measure, and not a real addressing of childcare policy. If that makes any sense.
I think that, I don't know, I think it goes without stating that we all understand these exemptions in one way or another are all imperfect, right? They all have a certain benefit that we deem to be worthy of this cost to our society, and it may work or may not. I don't think we have the time or resources to dedicate studies to all of them, and I think that we all understand that, yes, we're doing the best with what we have. And if the government were to have a universal child care in place, if there was such a facility, or if those employees or providers were even in place, then yeah, obviously it goes without stating we wouldn't have to worry about this. But I think that knocking this is some kind of imperfect exemption, I think goes without saying. I think that we all sort of understand that tax is really imperfect to begin with. This is all really costs and benefits that we're just trying our best to weigh.
Mr. Chair, I think in the long run, for-profit child care will be less expensive than the government running a business of child care. I don't think a government running, we know that when the government runs a business, it goes nowhere. So in the long run, I think giving them a tax break would be less expensive than the government running a child care itself.
I meant funding, not running. It's different to fund. So like Social Security or Medicare, right? Medicare is government funded, but not government. Your doctor doesn't work for the government. So just to be clear, a government funded child care.
I understand now. Government funded, but where did that money come from though? fund.
So New York City passed this, and they used property taxes to pay for it.
So you go back to property taxes, right?
Well, if you're the county,
yeah,
the state would be different. Yeah.
We'll never get away from property tax, right?
Nope.
Commissioner Pham, I see your hands up.
Yeah, I think that like one of the big hangups on this ordinance is just the very clear and explicit framing of for-profit. I think if there's an exemption that is just about group childcare centers and there's a justification, you know, written into the ordinance about why this is necessary, I think that may help, especially in light of the public testimony about the for-profit childcare exemption and the previous commission recommendation. I think what's lacking is a framing around this exemption. If it were to just say group childcare centers and there's a justification for it, then I think that helps optically. I'm not sure if that really helps in terms of the principle of the matter, but at least in the optics, removal of for-profit for claiming this exemption is important. But now whenever I expand it out to some of the other exemptions that we've talked about with nonprofits and including credit unions, I'm not sure how we can justify keeping this one and then later removing the exemption for credit unions. Just not trying to put them together, but I think that there's going to be an inconsistency here if we were to keep this and then get rid of something like the credit union exemption, or to recommend keeping this and then recommend elimination of the credit union exemption.
Thank you, Commissioner Pham. I actually see the comparison of the two to be an opposite, and that I think that the reconsideration of the credit union exemption is more so a victim of its own success. The proliferation of credit unions and the amount of ads and the members and the widespread nature of the credit unions is really what I think sort of gets to people, and it got us to reconsider the exemption. Whereas here, I think that the purpose and the purpose of childcare centers isn't so much that there's a lot of them about and we see them all as grifting off of the city. It's whether or not they're doing their job well enough, you know, whether or not they're providing it at a nonprofit, you know, at the nonprofit standard, or whether or not it's affordable enough. And I think that comparison is more of apples and oranges. It's different in that regard, because the focus on a for-profit childcare center here, the optics might look bad, but I think that even when they implemented this language, there was an understanding that yes, this will be for businesses and this will be benefiting those who go into a profit type of activity, but due to the shortage, we're still going to encourage it nonetheless. I think there's that understanding that the shortage here isn't quite comparable to the shortage of financial institutions that we deal with in the credit union situation.
Just a clarification from Commissioner Pham. When you say the framing of this name, for-profit, do you think if we eliminate the name for-profit and name it something else, would it pass?
I think it's just an optics and semantics issue. If that were the recommendation and not really substantive. But yeah, I don't really think that idea has much merit. I think it was more rhetorical on my part. But I am understanding what Commissioner Wong's saying here is that, you know, the reason for reconsidering the credit union exemption is about the exemption outliving its purpose. whereas this exemption, maybe there's a time when the purpose is outlived, but as of right now, its purpose has not been fulfilled completely, and therefore it should stay in place to fulfill that purpose of increasing the supply of childcare providers.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Okay, there being no additional comment at this time, I'd like to get a hand show vote, informal, as we did with the last item. To those who are in favor of maintaining the commission's recommendation that the exemption be repealed, or to those who wish to amend the recommendation to maintain the exemption. I don't think there's been a halfway point yet. If there is a halfway sort of option that we've looked at, floor is open. No, there being no comment. Just quick show of hands, and if Commissioner Aid White could take a count, please. Those in favor of maintaining the 2019 Commission's recommendation that the exemption be repealed for-profit group childcare centers.
And two hands are raised, Commissioner Pham and Commissioner Peters.
Okay. Those in favor of an amendment or to maintain the exemption, to amend the 2019 Commission's recommendation to maintain the for-profit group childcare exemption, those please raise your hands.
3 hands are raised, and we have a fourth with Commissioner Stormo Gibson.
Okay, there being a 4-3 based on the discussion here, my recommendation is that we move to recommend that in our report that we have considered the for-profit group childcare center exemption as contemplated by the 2019 Commission, but due to the shortage of group childcare centers, it continues to work towards the policy of providing additional childcare to the county. The Commission has no objections to the Council reviewing whether or not this is effective or researching the effect of this exemption because of the optics, as Commissioner Pham stated, because it does apply to for-profit businesses. The council may be well advised to examine and study what, just how much of an impact or how many group childcare centers are being open or maintained with this exemption in place.
And explore other options for providing quality, accessible daycare.
Certainly,
and
any other measures to alleviate the shortage of childcare. I think that's a worthy addition.
Tack onto that in lieu of the exemption.
Yeah, sure, that's fine. I just think they need to look at all options for providing quality childcare and what's most effective.
Absolutely. In lieu of or in addition to. I don't want to make it an either or thing.
Sure.
Okay. I think there being no further discussion to this, I'll make a formal motion to, I guess, recommend that or include a recommendation for the Commission in its report that we recommend the maintenance of or to maintain the for-profit group childcare center exemption, but to include verbiage recommending a study or reconsideration of the effect of the exemption because it does apply to for-profit businesses. And we also encourage this council to explore any other options or measures that would help to alleviate the child care shortage in lieu of or in addition to the current exemption.
Beautiful. Is there a
Second.
Second.
And we have seconds from Commissioner Peters and Commissioner Legal.
Okay, there being a second and absent objection to this motion, do we have unanimous consent to approve to this recommendation as discussed?
Yes.
Yes.
No objection.
With unanimous consent, the motion is approved, so ordered. Thank you, members. Turning to item 1C, the agricultural improvements exemption under ROH section 8-10.31. The recommendation of the subcommittee on credits and exemptions was to repeal this exemption, and RPAD confirmed that the exemption is not currently in use. The recommendation of the subcommittee is unchanged, although based on testimony at our prior meetings, I think from Commissioner Bean and other members, there was a request for further discussion. At this time, I'd like to open the floor.
If I could speak to that, please. So I think what I really liked is the idea of what Commissioner Stormo Gibson said about using tax policy to promote certain activities in our communities. And I think there is arguably no greater, well, one of the greatest concerns that we should have in our communities right now is food security. And whether or not it's currently being used, I've recently been talking to some farmers, and they were not even aware that this tax exemption was available to them. A lot of farmers are not necessarily savvy politically, though it would benefit all of us if they were. But I think that we need to be incentivizing agriculture ventures in our community right now. And I think that this exemption could have a lot of benefit. I mean, it's a limited exemption. It's only exempting the taxes on the improvements that are being made on agricultural lands for a period of 7 years. And that 7 years is just a recognition that there's a time variable to get from seed to profit. I think, in my opinion, we should be doing all that we can to incentivize our farming community, our agricultural ventures. And the absence of its use right now does not necessarily mean it's not going to be used in the future. And I think we should do everything that we can to encourage the use of our agricultural lands for the purposes of producing food.
Commissioner Pham, I see your hand up.
Yep, I think Commissioner Bean's argument here is valid, and I am supportive of keeping this exemption in place. I think that there's anything that we could recommend as a commission to maybe help make this exemption more known and to make sure that the outcomes intended by it are productive, is to recommend to the city council something to the extent of like a resolution or some way to get the word out to the owners of vacant agricultural lands that this exists and this is here to help them and to help them be productive with the land. I think that would be a productive output from the commission.
And in addition, I would like to see even more policy being used to incentivize the use of lands, more done. There's so much land out there that is not being used. And you know, when we're talking about the vacant agricultural lands, we're just talking about that portion of the land that's not being used for actual agricultural use. It's all of the things that support the agricultural ventures. So you're talking about drainage ditches, irrigation, and any kind of improvements like that. And those are all necessary for us to be able to become productive. And so I would be in support of any sort of recommendation that would encourage greater tax incentives to agricultural uses of our land.
Mr. Chair, this is Jack Eagle. Yeah, I think I agree with Commissioner Bean. One of the things that you mentioned is farmers are not even aware that this thing exists. So I think there's a lot of maybe part of it will be education as well, you know, and disseminate the information to the farmers. Give them the knowledge that a lot of that this tax exemption is in existence. It is an incentive for you to use the land so it can be productive. So I'm amazed that nobody uses because nobody knows about it. I think that's the problem, you know. Yeah. So it's a good one.
I would even go further to say we need to have tax policy that discourages the rezoning of agricultural lands for residential use, because once it's rezoned to residential, we will never farm that land again.
So
I knew I was going to get a comment to that.
Talking about whole feeding
I will say, I want to say, I agree with what people have been saying. And I think, Tracy, you make a good point that, you know, it is a matter of security to have farming happen, especially when you're on an island in the middle of the Pacific, and you know you want to be sure you have some food. So I took the exemption. I just wanted to say that yes, turning ag land to residential is not necessarily a public benefit unless it's 100% affordable, publicly financed. Kauai just did that. Kauai took about, I think, 20 acres of land, Limaola, and they made it from ag to residential, but it's 100% for local residents, 100% price restricted, affordable. So I would put that as a caveat. But in general, that's not what happens. So that's a affordable housing exemption. To your larger point.
Thank you, commissioners. I think that
just a question, Mr. Chair. But I think there's different grades of agriculture. It's A, B, and C. You know, and that was the problem here in Ho'opili when it turned into a residential, because they're saying that this land is grade A, or how do you call that thing? Grade A or class A. You know, meaning that it can be productive agricultural land. There are so many other lands that are not available to be productive to plant, you know. So I don't know what they're talking about here, agricultural improvements. So what do they mean by agricultural improvements in this one?
Right, so this goes to the assessment of agricultural property, and just as a quick overview, when you value a property, or when the city values a property, they value two things primarily. One is the real property, or the land itself, and the second is the improvements. And here, qualifying agricultural improvements, even if they're drainage systems or irrigation systems, even though they don't look like buildings, like improvements that we would value on other types of land or a property, they still qualify as improvements for the purposes of the appraisals. So those would be the qualifying agricultural improvements in this case.
There's a lot of, I don't know, there's a lot of issue on this one, I think, if you think about it. Like there was one, I think, agricultural land in Unconia. which they're not supposed to build houses, it has been improved, and then they started building houses there. So if the land is used for planting and using it for become productive, produce vegetables, whatever it is, then I think that's good, you know. But I think Commissioner Pham has his hands up, so.
Yeah, the ordinance around vacant agricultural lands and the improvements doesn't include residential uses. It's pretty clear that the reason why you would have these improvements is to make the land more productive so that you can start using it for actual farming. But you know, once you improve that, then the value of the property goes up, and therefore your tax bill is going to go up. So the purpose of the exemption is to offset that. And then once you start using it productively, I believe it would end up going to the agricultural land use classification instead of vacant agricultural, which is a lower rate. But this is sort of like the interim period in which you might be improving the land, but it's not yet being productive. And that's the purpose of it.
Correct. And it's only for a period of 7 years. So the exemption is for a limited period of time, recognizing that there is a time variable that has to be applied before they can become profitable, so to speak. And the vacant agricultural land has no residential improvement on it. All the improvements are to support the farming.
Thank you. And just to add on that, one of the requirements for the exemption as written requires that the property be dedicated for 10 years as dedicated ag property. So you've got a 10-year dedication and you've got a 7-year exemption. I think that covers the timing of the exemption pretty well, that it has to be committed to agricultural uses. Okay. Based on the discussion of the commission, at this time, I move to, I think that we've all been swayed by Commissioner Bean. I haven't seen any other comment to it, but I move that the commission recommend to maintain the agricultural improvement exemption under ROH section 8-10.31. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Absent objection to the motion, do we have unanimous consent to approve this recommendation as we just discussed?
Yes.
No objection.
With unanimous consent, motion approved, so ordered. Thank you, commissioners. Almost there. Turning now to item 1B, the credit union's exemption under ROH section 8-10.24. The recommendation of your subcommittee on credits and exemptions was to readopt 2019 Commission's recommendation to repeal this exemption, and this commission has deferred this matter for further discussion. We've also received testimony from the general public today, and I see Stephanie Sakamoto is still on the line observing, although I do not see Ms. Marks is still on the line. At this time, I'd like to open the floor to discussion, including... I'm sorry?
Arrow had to leave, but I'm still here.
Oh, thank you, Ms. Sakamoto. Commissioners, at this time, I'd like to open the floor to discussion, and if you do have questions that could be answered by Ms. Sakamoto, I open the floor to them as well.
Mr. Chair, I'm just going to open the discussion, I think. I certainly hear a lot more information about the credit unions today than the other meetings that we had. And as I was reading the testimony, one of the item there that struck me was, it seems to me that the credit union plays like a balancing role with the commercial banks, you know, so that a lot of times they look at the in their competition, they're saying, well, the union is only charging this, so it's like a balancing act. sort of a deterrent, if you. I don't want to use that word deterrent, but to somehow not to charge so much higher rates, things like that. So that was one of the ideas that kind of struck me while I was reading the testimony. And of course, we're not in a plantation era right now, and certainly everybody's trying to survive, everybody's trying to thrive, and everybody's looking for members, and including the commercial banks and things like that. And just like Kenna, I'm a member of USAA, and I really enjoyed it. And also Pentagon. I just opened an account with Pentagon because the rate is really high. So I moved from one credit union to Pentagon so that I can take advantage of a higher rate. So I still see the value myself personally of keeping the tax credit for credit unions, but that's just me, you know. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Legal.
Chair, this is Commissioner Peters. I have one final story I want to share with the commission regarding the credit unions. I think we all have heard over the last year all the pros and cons. You know, we know why the credit union wants to maintain it. It's in their interest to maintain the exemption, and we know all the arguments, you know, why people think they should lose the exemption. A few weeks ago, I went out to dinner with a childhood friend of mine. Another childhood friend of ours had opened a restaurant, so we wanted to go there, show our support. So this friend of mine is a retired fire captain. And when he retired about 10 years ago, he was asked to serve on that voluntary board of directors for their credit union. At that time, I didn't know we were going to actually get a letter from that credit union, you know, with the standard talking points of the credit unions. But anyway, when he told me that he was actually on the board of a credit union, I felt as his friend, I said, you know, I'm on this real property tax commission, and one of the things we're discussing is the exemption for credit unions. I said, just so you know, I'm kind of in favor of eliminating the exemption. So I was expecting that he would, of course, say, oh, no, we need to keep the exemption. He actually surprised me by saying he actually agreed that we should do it with the exemption, but his reason is quite interesting. He was saying that when he started about 10 years ago, there were about, I think there were close to 100 credit unions in the state. And he said the big credit unions are kind of like running them all out of business. So basically in his 10 years, dozens of credit unions have closed up, and the big ones are, I guess, getting a lot of their members. So he was actually he actually was in favor of us repealing the exemption. He also had mentioned that, you know, their credit union, the Firemen's Credit Union, is a small credit union, and it's basically open only to members, people who work for the fire department. He mentioned that most of these small credit unions are like 100 million, 200 million. I assume that's assets or deposits or whatever. But he said these big ones are well over $1 billion. So they're really, there's almost like two levels in this credit union, the big ones and the little ones. And I think the little ones continue to operate like it was 30 or 40 years ago. And I think these big ones are really the ones that are kind of operating like banks. These are the ones you see on TV advertising. You don't see the firefighters credit union running ads on TV. You see the ones that are out trying to get new members, the same credit unions that are, you know, opening up all the branches. So I don't know what's the, you know, the solution is. You know, it's possible. What I do know is that the big ones have basically opened up their membership to almost the general public. That's what my friend, the retired fire captain, had said. That basically they're open to almost everyone in the general public, whereas the little ones are the ones that still restrict membership. So, you know, I don't think you can differentiate the two. So I'm probably gonna, still support repealing the exemption, but, the other solution is trying to either by size or by how they determine the membership. That's other things you look at, but I think that's gonna complicate things considering, we have to do this today. So I think I'm still gonna go for the repeal, but I just found it interesting that here's, the credit union is very organized in how they come and testify at all of our meetings. But here's a guy that actually has been on the board, still sits on the board, and actually took the opposing view because he doesn't like what he sees happening in the state as a whole as far as credit unions go.
Thank you, Commissioner Peters. That was insightful. Just my own 2 cents on this matter. I do appreciate the testimony offered by the credit unions, and I think that we all agree that the access to financial institutions and better rates for members of the community are all things that we like. But it's just hard for me to shake that credit unions have really outlived the purpose of the exemption, and that they've almost been victims of their own success. When I look at the Hawaii Credit Union performance profile that was submitted as testimony on page 16 of the PDF document, I see that there's almost 921,000 members as of December 2021, which it's a significant amount of the population if we just count those members as people. And with 170 branches, it's been a big increase since the 100 or so credit unions that we heard about with Commissioner Peters. They've really expanded, they've been successful, and I think they continue to offer good services to their members, and we appreciate that. And I don't think that removing the exemption will change that materially, because I think as a whole, the credit union model depends on the nonprofit status and structure, which requires it to pass its benefits on to its members instead of to have a profit margin. And while that profit margin may be smaller, and while those benefits being passed on may be smaller, I think that with 921,000 members in the state, that's a cost that almost equals the amount of residents in Honolulu. So whether we spread it out through the credit unions or we decide to spread it out throughout the rest of the state, I think we all end up paying. And just from an optics perspective, when we have credit unions doing so well and being so prevalent in advertising, it's hard to justify keeping this exemption on the books. There being no further comment at this time, I'd like to take another informal hand vote. Commissioner Nate White, if you could take a count, please, as you have with the prior votes. Just as a show of hands, commissioners, those in favor of maintaining the exemption for credit unions under ROH section 8-10.24, those in favor of maintaining the exemption on the books, please raise your hands.
And 2 commissioners have raised their hand.
Okay, thank you. And those commissioners in favor of repealing the exemption regarding credit unions, please raise your hands.
And 4 commissioners have raised their hands.
Okay, based on this informal vote and discussion, I move that the commission adopt a recommendation to repeal the credit union exemption as previously recommended by the subcommittee on credits and exemptions. I think that along with this recommendation, I am not opposed, and I would like to include language acknowledging the testimony by the credit unions and acknowledging that the good that they do serve in the communities. I think it's important that we recognize them and that they are committed to their causes and that they have showed up here and provided testimony. That being the motion, do I have a second?
Second by Commissioner Peters.
Members, any discussion? If no discussion and absent objection to this motion, do we have unanimous consent to approve this recommendation as discussed as the ruling of the commission?
Yes.
And Commissioner Bean and Commissioner Legal, are you both in support?
Yeah.
Thank you. With unanimous consent, motion approved, so ordered. Thank you, Commissioners. Finally, turning now to item 1A, the homeowner's exemption under ROH Section 8-10.4. The recommendation of this commission has been to increase the amount of this exemption, and we have deferred this matter for further discussion regarding how much the exemption should be for and how best to determine what that amount should be. The floor is now open to discussion. Just to start off conversation on this, I was reading the Star Advertiser recently, and there was an article discussing the city's budget and the city's revenues and exemptions to homeowners, and there have been complaints by homeowners as to the exemption amount in light of increases in home values. I don't think that's changed. Although there were no bills advanced as to the homeowners exemption in the past session. I don't see any on record or on our agenda today, so we're free to discuss this at our own discretion.
And Chair, if I may briefly interject regarding the homeowners exemption on page 7 of the draft final report, there is a chart that includes the existing 8-10.4 as well as 3 separate bills during 2022 that are active and pending but not being heard yet by the council. That would be Bill 7, Bill 35, and Bill 40. Those are noted on your agenda as well under item 1A. But the chart on page 7 of the draft report lays out the distinction between the 3 bills. But again, it's just changing the numbers. One aspect to look possibly more closely at is the low income gradation that occurs, where it's up to 140, 160, 180, and 200, and whether those numbers should be increased as well. But the form of calculation amongst Bill 7, 35, and 40 recommends some type of adjustment according to a consumer price or inflation index, as opposed to the current under existing ROH 8-10.4 is just setting an amount with no future adjustment anticipated. So those are the 3 bills. They're largely they're not identical, but they're not dissimilar largely. And it's just a question of the recommendations of the commission regarding the threshold and how to determine it.
I see. Thank you. Oh, Commissioner Stormer Gibson.
I think on this question of exemptions, similar to previous discussions we've had today, like Commissioner Breen brought up, with the preservation exemption, a person's ability to pay should matter, right? So if you are doing really well and property taxes are a super insignificant part of your income, do we need to give you a tax break? Not with the funding needs that we have. So I just think if there's going to be a homeowner's exemption increase, shouldn't it be income targeted? In other words, you could say, hey, we have that cap, right? That circuit breaker. And maybe we say, $60,000 is not very high. Maybe the circuit breaker should go up to 100,000. In other words, your house went up $10,000 in value. You got $10,000 of equity, and so you're having to pay some tax on that equity. That's what we're saying. But there are people who literally can't afford it because they're on a fixed income, because they don't have cash, they don't have money. So for those people, sure, let's ensure that they can stay in their home. Absolutely. But for everybody else that has high incomes, they have added home equity. And do we need to be giving them a break as opposed to renters? Don't get any break. Renters, your rent can go up. There's no rent control. You can be told to move within 30 days. We have basically no renter protections in Hawaii. And if you don't have a house at all, if you're one of the 5,000 houseless people, you're not getting a break out there. So I'm just wondering why we would prioritize homeowners who have the income as giving them a tax break as opposed to helping renters or people that don't even have a house. Unless you're on a fixed income. If we want to help out people on a limited income, I would support some kind of adjustment for people who just don't have the income to pay it. That makes sense.
Thank you, Commissioner Pham.
Yeah, I think that the thing I would like to add to the discussion here is actually looking ahead at agenda item 3 about looking at the tiering of all the residential properties and putting them into quartiles and then assigning different rates according to the quartiles with marginal tax brackets. That's a lot of word vomit right there, I'm sorry. But the effect of that idea that came out of the policy subcommittee and then got discussed by rates and classifications is that would effectively eliminate any need for a dollar amount homeowners exemption. Instead, you would have rates that the city council could adjust every year whenever they set the rates for property taxes by their annual resolution. And that would allow them to be flexible every year without having to worry about a fixed dollar amount being written into the ordinance anywhere. I think that's a long-term solution. So this discussion, I see it as really limited in only being a short-term issue for the next few years, in hopes that the technology improvements would be made so that our property tax methods and the systems that manage those would be similar to Maui. But as long as we don't have that kind of technology in place with the department, then it's gonna be hard to accomplish that. So ideally, I would like to see this exemption just be eliminated effectively by that other idea. But for now, I am willing to say, just for a short term, qualifying this as a short term solution, offering that raise. But the bills that are put in front of us that the city council's already started to consider, effectively it saves you $70 if you're a homeowner, $70 a year. That's it. It's kind of mini-me. So maybe the recommendation is we don't take any action here.
Right, just jumping onto this, I think relating to the comments by Commissioner White, the three bills on our agenda, of these, Bill 35 includes language to annually adjust the home exemption for inflation. So I think that is on the table right now for the council. As to Commissioner Storma Gibson's comments on the ability to pay taxes and those qualifying for the exemption should include those who are most in need of it. I think that's what the current flat rate does, right? I mean, as your property becomes more valuable and you supposedly, or I guess you should have more resources to pay your higher tax bill, that flat amount is less of a percentage, or it's less less important to you. Although for those who are at the lower incomes with presumably lower value homes, this will be more impactful to them. So I think that the flat amount would resolve that if we intended to keep it. Of the recommendations that we contemplated in our prior meetings, one of them was revising the exemption to just be a percentage of home value instead of the flat rate amount. Was there any further support of that? I know we had prior testimony, but it hasn't been mentioned here. We've mentioned increases in the flat rate amounts, and we've mentioned changes to the tiering system and the elimination of the exemption. But are there any comments as to changing the form of the exemption to a percentage as to a flat rate?
I wouldn't be supportive of that. I think the city council already has the ability to offer relief to homeowners whenever it sets the rates every year. So if they want to adjust it, they can adjust it by changing the rate.
Thank you, Commissioner Pham.
Chair Wong, this is Commissioner Peters. I just wanted to share my position on this exemption. I'm in a different situation than I think the rest of the commissioners, so I'm probably just going to defer to the rest of you and on how we decide our recommendation. I think I'm the only one on the commission who's just about to turn 65 years old. So being that this exemption would benefit me personally, I would vote against it just because I don't want to be a commissioner who's voting in favor of my own self-interest. So I'm going to vote against it. I don't know which way you guys are going to go, but whichever way you guys go, I'm going to agree with you. But I don't want to help myself out here. So that's
Commissioner Peters, this is Jack Legal. I'm 72.
Oh, okay. Well, then there's two of us.
Thank you for you know. So just like you, I'm gonna live in the silent list. You're 65, I'm 72, you know, so and these guys are younger than us, so
Not much. Not much younger.
Okay. Well, just adding my 2 cents on this. Thank you, Commissioner Peters and Commissioner Legal. I think that increases have been contemplated by the council, and since the outset of this commission's meetings, I think the public has expressed desire to make the homeowner's exemption, which is the most popular and most costly exemption, commensurate with increases in home value prices. I think that we all understand that in an age of both rising real estate values and inflation, that if the exemption amount remains the same while home values increase, homeowners are essentially going to be taxed based on just these increases, and the exemption is going to have less of an effect down the line. This has been reflected in previous changes by the council as they have revised the amount and increased it in the past. However, I think in the past year, we've seen some pretty drastic increases, both in real property values and inflation, which has spurred the public to comment on this issue. I think that matching this to a percentage would be the easiest way, although not the most progressive. So in light of the progressive concerns and the fairness concerns that we should contemplate, I think that having a flat amount but linking it to at least inflation is the most we can ask for relief for the public at this time, at least the most practical. relief that we can ask with the system that we have in place. This goes without saying that the classification system may be changed. We can change the rates and tiers and implement other policies, but with the status quo, I think folks will be looking to the commission primarily. This will be one of the top things that they look at. What do we recommend of the homeowner's exemption? And I think that suggesting action and suggesting that we match their concerns at least with inflation. If we can't do it with property values in a progressive or fair way, that's okay. But matching with inflation is a step in the right direction, and we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good here. So I would be in favor of the language suggested by Bill 35, actually, to have the council and or the Real Property Assessment Division re-examine the homeowner's exemption in accordance with the consumer price index or other inflation indices.
I think Commissioner Snowball Gibson would like to make a comment.
Oh, certainly. Sorry, I only have 6 people on my screen, so if you raise your hand and I don't see you, I apologize.
I think, you know, if the public would like to increase that exemption, just the exemption amount by inflation, which is about 3% a year. So, you know, from 100 grand to 103 grand to then 106 grand, you know, okay, fine. I do think though, if you are going to decrease revenue in some area that would have come to the city, then you need to have an alternative to make up for it. So it's fine if the policy goal is we want to, you know, give homeowners a relief if it's your primary property. I don't know why we would give second homeowners relief. I'm not sure the policy goal there. But if that's the case and you want to tie it to inflation, fine. But what is the revenue to offset that loss? So I know in Maui, when they've restructured their taxes, they did give people a boost in homeowners exemption, but it was offset by increases in second home taxes and short-term rental taxes. So I think that policy-wise, it's important to recognize that the revenue has a purpose, and the purpose is for the, you know, public good. So if we're going to have a decrease in one area, there should be proposed increases someplace to make up for that.
If I could make a comment on that, I see where you're coming from, Kenna. I totally understand that, but I think that we're going to be seeing those. We've already seen those increases through the massive increases in property values over the last 3 years. I mean, I'm just thinking about my mom in particular. She's living in the home that, you know, we grew up in, and the increases in her property value are hugely drastic, and any kind of relief would be sort of a band-aid for her. I mean, she's just having a tough time financially. Just trying to keep up with all of the increases in prices across the board, let alone just increases to her home. I mean, we've had to have very difficult conversations about her selling. And, you know, thankfully, we're in a position as her children to help her financially, but not everybody is in that position. So I do understand where you're coming from, but I do also believe that the offset is already there in the sense of property home values increasing exponentially. I mean, we're not talking about 3% increases. They've been huge. Generally speaking, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, we could say that you could assume that your home value would double every 7 years, or every 14 years, excuse me. That has not been true over the last 3 years.
I'm curious, and not that we would, I mean, that makes sense what you're saying, Commissioner Bean, and I appreciate you sharing
that, you know, people have been paying a lot higher taxes because of these values. So maybe the overall revenue of the county has been going up. It does make sense, like people on fixed incomes. I wonder, just out of curiosity, we wouldn't have time, I think, for this report, but some states have programs where folks can opt to not have their property tax increase at all until that property is sold, and then they would pay that added amount when the property is sold. Because
deferred.
Basically deferred, because it recognizes that, you know, there is an increase in value. Somebody's going to get that equity increase. Like, there is a benefit, you know, but your mother doesn't feel that right now because it's not like she's, you know, renting it out to somebody or Airbnb-ing it, or, you know, she's not taking advantage of that value. All that she feels is this added tax. On the other hand, at some point that value will be realized, you know, when that home is sold or turned to a different use, right? So I guess I'm curious if a program like that would, you think, be appealing?
Just to comment on that, I think that that deferring property taxes would be, I think it would be, one, difficult to estimate a continuous flow of income to the city, because we know about hot markets and cold markets, and if there is a cold market and that if there aren't a lot of property sales, then who knows, right? Maybe you know, revenues will decrease because we don't have enough deferred gains that we're realizing in that year. But if we have a hot market, maybe the city's coffers will be overflowing. I think as is with the annual assessments and the annual bills, it's a steady and predictable stream of income for the city to realize. And I just think the logistics of a deferred gain would be awfully difficult, not only for the homeowners to plan out for, because what happens if somebody passes away, then you have to deal with the deferred gain. And if they want to keep it in the family, does that also defer? There's questions there, but not only from the homeowners, but also for the city and its budgets, logistics, planning out its own budgetary needs. I think that the annual assessments and just applying them from property to property is probably the easiest way to achieve that.
I'm really sorry, you guys. I'm going to have to go. I have a meeting scheduled at 2:30 and people are starting to gather. So I apologize, but I'm going to have to sign out.
Thank you, Commissioner Bean. Commissioner White, do we still have quorum?
You still have quorum, and Commissioner Bean, I will follow up with you with updates on anything that was missed in your absence.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry. I apologize.
No problem.
Thank you for letting us know. Okay, if I just look at our own schedule here, Commissioner White, was this viewed as our final meeting, or were we going to have a chance to review the final report and offer some type of comment on that at a future date?
Yeah, tomorrow at 2 o'clock.
Okay, right. The homeowner's exemption is something I think that's important. Do we expect to have all the commissioners there?
You know,
believe
tomorrow.
other than
I think
Commissioner
I'm
Liga.
able to make it, yeah, tomorrow, because I have an all-day meeting. I'll try, but
Okay. Let's do this. Let's do an informal hand vote again, and I will do my best to try and characterize our options here and lay them out before soliciting a vote. Just a hand show. It looks like, based on our discussion, we've got options to repeal the homeowner's exemption. Obviously, we've got options to increase it and tie it to inflation is the metric that we seem to have discussed. I don't think we've seen any other metric to tie it to the market value or market increases yet. So I'm leaving that off, absent further objection. And then in addition to that, I think that we've also had some type of discussion as to an increase in this, but also adding provisions to limit its application to certain taxpayers or certain higher properties, and letting that sort of add a level of progressivity to the homeowners exemption. I think, if I understand correctly, that looks to be our three choices there. So starting with the first choice, just by a show of hands, can I get a show as to commissioners who would be in favor of repealing the homeowners exemption outright?
No hands raised.
Thank you, Commissioner Aid White. At this time, can I get a show of hands, please, as to commissioners who would be in favor of a recommendation to increase the homeowners exemption and tie it to inflation or another similar metric?
Three hands raised.
Thank you, Commissioner White. At this time, can I get a show of hands for commissioners who would be in favor of a recommendation to increase the level of the exemption with inflation, but also with the caveat that there be a limitation applied to the exemption for higher value properties so as to increase progressivity?
Oh, sorry, I would have voted for this option.
Okay.
I have a question, Commissioner Wong. Is maintaining the exemption with no increase an option?
Yes, I should have left that on. I'm sorry. Finally, if you have voted, please if you have voted but do not believe that was your best choice, raise your hand if you believe that we should maintain the status quo as is, meaning keeping the flat exemption at the current rates.
You got one vote, so it's 2-2-1 for your last three options.
Lovely, lovely.
If you need me to be the tiebreaker, I'll vote for the one with the caveats.
The one with the caveats. Okay, so we've got a 3-2 in favor of a recommendation to increase the amount of the homeowners exemption and tie it to a metric such as inflation or other similar indice, but also to revise the exemption to apply to cap out for certain properties.
Yes.
Would that cap also be tied to an inflation metric? Or should we put it to a quartile, top quarter, top eighth? What would be a fair or a reasonable metric of property value?
Oh, the top quarter at least. I mean, yeah, the top quarter of first of all, those are very high. Those are going to be pretty high value properties, and you're only being taxed on the increase in your value, so you already have a benefit. I mean,
well, I think I don't know if I understand that the increase in the value comment.
You if you're old enough, you could take out a reverse mortgage and pay that, right? Or
I don't think that's we don't give financial advice at the commission.
Anyway, I hear what you're saying, and I'm just saying I would go for at least the top quarter. Yeah.
Okay, I think that as a way to get this off of our desks, I think that agreeing that a certain percentile of a certain top percentile of properties at the council's discretion should be no longer qualified for the homeowners exemption. Is that acceptable to Commissioners Fan and Stormo Gibson?
Yes, I'm satisfied with that.
Okay.
And I don't have a preference on naming what that cutoff should be in terms of a percentile. And as long as it's in the recommendation that be done, then the city council can debate as to what that cutoff should be, and we can debate that as a community in city council hearings instead.
I agree.
Chair Wong, if I can, given that there's gonna be some revising and typing on my part here, is there any connection with what you all just discussed and are discussing with what Commissioner Stormo Gibson mentioned of the give and take, in that the option you guys have just appear to be ready to move forward with of increasing the exemption but throttling it back with a cap on a certain percentile, is that a potential give and take where Commissioner Stormo Gibson said, okay, if you want to increase it, where are you going to get the added revenues that you're losing, and that loss in revenues is made up by cutting off these high-end people or this higher percentile property group?
My understanding is that we're not gonna. It would be inefficient and almost impractical just to measure the increases in tax alone on that increase. I think that would be difficult to implement. My understanding was that if you maybe limit the homeowner's exemption to the 99 or 98th, 90, 75th, the 75% of the homes in the bottom, something along those lines. But if you were above that certain percentile in total home value, I'm not talking about increases, because what if a lower value property has a really high increase in value, but it's still only $300,000? That doesn't accomplish any goal there. I think just saying that we support an increase in the amount of the exemption, but also recommend that the exemption be limited to the bottom percentile of homes, or the top percentile of homes at the council's discretion be excluded from claiming the homeowner's exemption in that year.
Right.
That was my understanding. If
Thank
Commissioners Pham, Stormer, Gibson, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, that sounds accurate. And to kind of confirm that discussion on how it's offsetting, is that by not having the claims to the top X percentile, then that's what's funding the ability to increase the exemption for the other properties. So,
great. Okay. We have not had a formal motion, but I hereby move to adopt the recommendation as stated in our discussions as to an increase in the homeowner's real property exemption, and to adjust it as to inflation or other similar indices, but also to include language and to recommend that the homeowner's exemption be limited to a percentile of homeowners, or that homeowners in the top percentile of property values be excluded from claiming the homeowner's exemption. Do I have a second?
Is that Commissioner Legal?
Pham.
That was Mr. Pham. I'm sorry.
Thank you. If no discussion and absent objection to this motion, do we have unanimous consent to approve this recommendation as discussed?
Yes.
No objection.
With unanimous consent, motion approved and so ordered.
So Chair Wong, with that motion and approval, and when it's flushed out in writing, tomorrow you all can digest it a bit more and obviously make further motions if you wanted to set a specific threshold, or if you wanted to set a specific dollar amount or whatnot. Those types of things can be ironed out tomorrow, but we'll ideally get the gist in play, and then you guys can go from there.
Thank you, Commissioner White. My understanding is that we keep these relatively vague, for lack of better words. We suggest as a policy that the amount increase, but not by a certain percentage. I don't want to get caught up in the weeds, and that the percentages be left to the council's discretion. But that's just my understanding here. I don't want to spend too much time on it.
Sounds good.
Thank you. You've got your work cut out for you and typing up all the recommendations. Thank you. Okay. I know this was not on the agenda, but there was a discussion earlier on about the nonprofit revisions to the nonprofit exemption that we discussed. I don't think it requires a reconsideration, but I do want to state for those in attendance and on the record that Commissioner Pham and I, when we looked at the nonprofit exemption and changes to it, we did contemplate that if changing it from charitable strictly to, or from nonprofit strictly to charitable, it would decrease the amount of exemptions and a lot of institutions would be affected. However, the ambiguity in the statute right now between the title, which states charitable purposes, and the language, which states nonprofit, it requires attention by the council to clear that up. And if the council wants to keep it open to nonprofits, they should revise the title to reflect the language of the actual statute. Or if they truly intend for it to be a charitable exemption, then to revise it in accordance with IRS 501c3 as recommended in our previous report, our previous recommendation. Commissioner Stormer Gibson?
2:30, I gotta run. Thanks, Phil. I'll see people tomorrow.
Thank you.
You still have
wait, we still, thank you. One by one. Okay. There being no further discussion on action item number 1, I'd like to move to agenda item 2, where we have 4 recently introduced bills related to real property tax pending before the council. To be honest, I have not looked over these in as much detail as I would have liked. And this would be our first time discussing these bills. I think that we've already been going for 2.5 hours. If it's okay with the commission, I would feel better postponing it till tomorrow. Commissioner Legal, I know you will not be here, but
I'll try to join you guys, but I don't know how long is my meeting tomorrow. But
thank
we'll
you.
See. Yeah.
But if you do have any comments, please relate them in an email to the rest of the commissioners. If you relate them to me, I will be sure to relay those to the commission in your absence.
All right.
I move that we postpone agenda item 2 for discussion tomorrow. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you. Absent objections.
Chair Wong, I also just might suggest that maybe we make no recommendations on the items in number 2, just because they've been brought to us today and basically our term ends tomorrow. So it might be easy for us to just leave it.
Okay, I know I don't want to entirely foreclose because there may have been some commissioners who've already read this and wish to comment on it. In that case, I will keep it in mind that we should keep it short tomorrow, but seeing as that these bills are on the agenda, they were provided and folks may have read them. I think that if commissioners feel strongly about them, I think we should allow them to provide some type of comment, but I don't think we will recommend or require that we recommend any action on these items. Is that okay?
Sounds good to me.
Great. Absent objection to the motion to continue discussions on action item 2 on the agenda, do we have unanimous consent?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion approved, so ordered with unanimous consent. This brings us now turning to agenda item 3 for action, the proposed retiering or restructuring of Honolulu's residential RPT classification under ROH section 8-3. Commissioner Pham, will you please provide the commission with an update from the Rates and Classification Subcommittee to start off this discussion?
Yes. The report that we wrote for a few meetings ago still stands on this recommendation. If there's anything that I would like to add now, not having had a committee meeting prior to this, is that I think the full commission's recommendation, the strongest part of the recommendation, just needs to emphasize the need for the city and county to invest in its technology in order to accomplish some of these goals. We have data now from RPAD that breaks apart the combination of residential classified and residential A classified properties together. and breaks those into quartiles. And so we're actually able to see the range of values. And I think that if we're looking at Maui's residential property tax tiering system and how they reclassified everything as a goal, the first part of accomplishing that goal is going to be in investing in technology. Without that, anything that we might have discussed as an aspiration just would not be able to be accomplished. So when it comes to the purposes of this report and what goes into it, just making sure that the strongest part of the recommendation is about a need for investing in technology that can manage this.
Thank you, Commissioner Pham. And just going through the subcommittee report, what page is there a provision in the subcommittee report that on that portion you would have emphasized?
Let's see here. I don't think there was.
I see bullet point on page 3, right below the first bullet point. I think that's the second one.
Yeah.
Okay.
That would need to go into this recommendation as the main point of emphasis. Everything else that has to do with numbers, that's just sort of showing you with dollar amounts and with percentages a possibility, but not necessarily a recommendation.
Okay. For the subcommittee, there is a pending bill, Bill 35, it creates a new RPT exemption for long-term leases. I don't know if the consideration of the empty homes tax took that into account. Has there been any movement, or is there any change in the subcommittee's thoughts based on the creation of an exemption for long-term leases?
No, I don't think so. Just speaking for myself here, I did see the language in Bill 35 that adds that long-term renter occupied exemption, and that's just essentially giving us the same dollar amount problem of the homeowner's exemption. So now you have a homeowner's exemption, now you have a long-term renter's exemption, and therefore everyone's just been exempted out. So effectively what you need to do if you want to accomplish the same goals of the empty homes tax is to raise the property tax rates and then make sure that all of the residents of the city and county, whether they are owner occupants or long-term renters, or rather the property owners of the long-term renters, get the exemptions necessary so that they are not as impacted by those rising rates. I think that the long-term strategy of just having set rates for owner-occupied properties and then non-owner occupied long-term renter properties and then vacant residential properties without any dollar amount exemption in front and just having different sets of rates would be a much more efficient way for the county to manage things. But again, without the technology to manage that, it's not going to be feasible.
Understood. Okay, I don't know if we've gone through on the recommendations in real detail. I don't recall, but I'm just going to go through the report just so we have these on the record. As to the land value tax study recommendation, were there any comments?
As it's written, I think is satisfactory.
Okay.
Just for study, right?
Yeah, just a study.
Just a study.
Okay. Thank you. Moving on to the comprehensive residential real property tax restructuring recommendation. The commission is providing, or the subcommittee is proposing 4 actions. First, eliminate the residential classification, eliminate Res A classification and associated tiered rates, but to implement residential owner-occupied classification and to implement residential long-term rental classification with 4-tier rates for both of them based on annual quartiles of RPAD valuations. What was the baseline argument or reason or policy reason for doing this, Commissioner Fan?
The baseline reason was the one, it's the confusion between residential and residential A, and then the presence of tiering for residential A, but no tiering for residential. So we discussed that as a committee is looking for an alternative method, and the policy subcommittee gave the Maui structure as a model for what we might aspire to. And then we talked at length about the homeowner's exemption, and in the previous full commission discussions regarding the application of a rate instead of a set dollar amount for the homeowner's exemption. We looked at that and said, well, effectively you're just dealing with the rate. So why not instead just have a homeowner occupied property rate and that be it? So you don't have to do the additional math of having a set dollar amount to subtract from the taxable value, and then having a different set of rates for long-term renters, and then having a different set of rates for empty, vacant residential property. And then we talked about the tiers. Again, this was proposed by one of the bills that we were considering last year, proposed at the City Council, and we discussed the tiering structure. Well, how do you do the cutoffs for the tiers? And what we came up with was to have the entire data set broken apart into quartiles, and that every year these quartiles would be updated according to the appraised values, and you sort that data set. So instead of having your set dollar amounts and having to adjust with inflation, the data set naturally adjusts itself year over year. And now you have your tiers that can adjust and be flexible every year with the setting of the rates by the City Council through ordinance, or through resolution, excuse me. So that was the basis, is taking all the discussions regarding homeowners exemptions and trying to prioritize homeowners in the property tax relief, but also not leaving behind long-term renters, and then adding that level of progressive taxation through tiering that we see in residential A, but applying it across the board, and giving the city and county the opportunity to be flexible. That was the underlying basis for how we concluded the quartile recommendation and the tiering.
Thank you. My comments on this, I may be in the minority here, but I am hesitant to endorse a revamp of the classification system. I think that the current system in place is efficient, and its simplicity is something that we would be remiss to overlook. When we value property now, we look at highest and best value, and we look at the type of property that it is, and that's what the residential rate currently reflects. And residential A is sort of a tangent to that. It's been its own sort of animal, but at the end of the day, we know what residential property is, right? It's a house, it's a dwelling unit, it's got a bed, and it's got a kitchen and those sorts of amenities. And changing over to a owner occupied classification or a non-owner occupied classification or a long-term residential classification, you've got this type of use that has to be monitored by RPAD, and that requires resources. And it's also something that, and coupled with a 4-tier rate, it increases the complexity of the tax system. And I know as an attorney who has to deal with a lot of taxpayers that they barely can understand our current real property tax system. And the simplicity of the rates as they are right now is probably, it's probably difficult for half the people to understand, but by putting 4 rates in there, we're going to cut that in half as well. I think that we make this a lot harder for people to understand, and I think that the assessors are going to have a harder time enforcing and holding people accountable and making sure that this accurately reflects the actual use of the property, as opposed to the pretty simple standard of highest and best use that we use for mass valuations across the island. I recognize that this is being used to push policy, and that those policy goals are admirable, but I just don't think the juice is worth the squeeze here, in my opinion.
I just want to respond on the simplicity aspect. I think the underlying goal of the simplicity here is that instead of having the homeowner's exemption, that you have just a separate rate. So currently people can claim a homeowner's exemption. So that still stays in place. If you can claim the homeowner's exemption now, that's the rate that you get. And now you don't even have to claim the exemption. You're just on this rate schedule. And then when it comes to having multiple tiers, the way that it is broken down is the same way as how we pay our federal income taxes. So it is marginal taxation brackets, and it's just evenly applied in the example of quartiles that we're using. So I think there still is a level of simplicity, and there is a trade-off in simplifying by removing that homeowner's exemption, and instead just saying your exemption is you have a different set of rates. So you still qualify with the same declaration that we have now.
Right. In response to that, I think that the current exemption, as we discussed for homeowners, it's really pretty small, and in comparison to the value of the home, it's $100,000, and it's a percentage of that, right? And when we're looking at phasing out the exemption and we're tinkering with the actual rates, you're looking at a much larger impact here. Whereas if a homeowner forgets to file, as they often do for their homeowner exemption, they miss out on maybe a couple $100 here and there. Whereas if they have entirely different rates affecting their home, you're dealing with, at least with the median home in Hawaii, you're dealing with $1 million property, and that can be very impactful, because the percentages will affect the entire value of the property, especially if you're dealing with increases at higher levels. If you go into a higher tier, then that's going to be especially impactful or critical for someone. I can just tell you, in my experience as an attorney, you wouldn't believe how many property owners who live on their properties do not sign up for the homeowner's exemption, and it's just across the board change the rates on them and have them participate, in essence, to require them to claim a certain classification is something that I think a lot of people will be caught off guard with. And I think just from a practical standpoint, this is what you're dealing with. You're not dealing with sophisticated commercial real estate buyers here. You're dealing with people who buy residential properties from all spectrums.
Chair Wong, this is Commissioner Peters. I have a suggestion. So, Commissioner Pham, myself, and Commissioner Ligoa, we were on the subcommittee, and, we were waiting for a long time to get the actual numbers from RPAD so we could see what the quartiles would look like. But what this doesn't show is, at our meeting, I don't know if you remember this, Commissioner Pham, you would actually put in sample rates for each quartile to show, and of course, we're not gonna tell the council, these are the rates you should do, but as an example, and I think if my memory serves me correctly, the first quartile, I think you had 0.25, which is lower than the current rate of 0.35. The second quartile, you had 0.35, which is same as, and I think you went up in the third quartile to like 0.65, and then I think the fourth quartile was something around 1.05 or something like that. But if you put that in the exhibit, I think it'd be easier for both Chair Wong and down the road when if this gets passed on to the council, for them to see what our intent was. Because you gotta remember, Chair Wong, let's say we take the quartiles, okay, let's say we go with median, right? It's 346, 200, then the second quartile is 636, 700, okay? Even if you own a $5 million home, you would get the lowest tax rate on the first 346, 200. And then you would get the second rate on the next amount, and only when you go over the 1.3 million would you be taxed at that highest rate. But everybody's gonna see a benefit on your first 346, 200. So it's not that complicated. I mean, you could do the calculations with a simple spreadsheet if you want to, but I mean, RPET has much more capability than that. But it wouldn't be that complex, and it's just I guess our intent was to have a progressive rate. Our feeling is that the people with the wherewithal to pay more should pay more, and people who own $5 or $10 million homes can pay a little more. And again, we're not going to set the rates, but I think we should show the council, like for example, let's say the council doesn't want to charge everybody the same rate. They could put 0.35 for all four quartiles and basically nothing changed. But you can, what having this system does is it gives future councils the flexibility. It's like a tool in their toolbox. Let's say they are facing a huge shortfall. How can we raise revenue? Well, maybe it's better that we can have different rates for in the different quartiles and the different classifications. Not classification, the different tiers, okay? And they can raise the necessary revenue, and every year they're gonna change the rates. Even, let's say for policy, let's say everybody's always talking about we need more affordable housing. Everything they try to do to incentivize developers never works, right? I mean, we still have an affordable housing problem here. But you could easily look at these quartiles and say, hey, I'm gonna put a real high rate on high-end properties. Maybe that would encourage developers to develop affordable housing, because buyers wouldn't want to pay the high tax, so they may want to buy more. It would be easier for them to sell the lower priced property. Right now, they want to build luxury properties because they make more money off of it. But if you can't sell the luxury properties, then maybe they might start building more affordable properties because they can move them out fast. It gives the council so much more flexibility, meeting their budget, using the rates for, to establish policy. It gives them a lot of options. But again, I think Commissioner Pham, you remember what I'm talking about, right? Where you put the rates in. So you can put in this exhibit, say, okay, and give them 2 or 3 examples. Give them the one you had, and maybe one with higher rates. And again, if they need to help the lower value properties, they can lower that rate even further. It's just
Commissioner Peters, I did actually take the method that was outlined in our written report, and then I had some examples, and the cutoff for when a property would end up having to pay more in taxes. The cutoff for an owner-occupied property would be 1.1 million, and then for a non-owner occupied property would be 1.3 million. And if we want to put that into the recommendation, just the example, the comparative difference, just for example purposes, I can provide that to Commissioner White so that it's nice and clear what that looks like. And then we can look at that tomorrow. But I do have the numbers based on what we wrote into the report so that we could compare.
Okay.
Yeah, in a way, I understand where Commissioner Wong is coming from, because I don't know if you recall when we first discussed about this residential A. I mean, it went through so many iterations, you know, because it gets so complicated, and I think the taxpayers are just getting used to it now. But still, they still miss filing for home exemptions, and if they miss, then they are taxed. If they buy over 1 million, they're taxed as a residential A. So, but I think our goal here is to make it as simple as possible, and it seems that what we have come up with seems to be simple and a lot of flexibility. I think, you know, as Commissioner Peter was saying, it's a lot of flexibility in the future. Council to go up and down on the rates. Yeah. As of now, there's nothing you can do about it because it's set. I understand what you're saying about Commissioner Wong, you know. So,
yeah, and I don't see that the residential A classification has been much of a success. If there are only 14,530 properties in the classification, and then 260,155 properties in residential, it seems like they create a classification that's, I mean, it's not very meaningful.
Well, getting into Res A requires that you do not have a homeowner's exemption and that you have a certain value above the $1 million cutoff. So I think that it's not like, I don't know, we haven't been able to track down those properties. That's just what they are. If they have a homeowner's exemption, that they're already going to be owner occupied. It's not like we could just stuff them into Res A as is. But yeah, and if they're not $1 million, then they don't qualify. So
you're involved in the tax appeal as well, Commissioner Wong, right? And we have a lot of people coming because they missed their home exemption. They're appealing their value, but they're actually Res A. So what can you do? You know,
right? You know, it is a very common problem, and I understand I'm in the minority here, but just seeing people who are not involved in their real property taxes getting caught off guard like this, I think that they're more common than we think, and that not everybody's following the tax commission recommendations. So I think that we've had enough discussion on this. I'm okay to move to a vote, although I think I know where it's going. But at this time, I'd like to move to adopt or amend the subcommittee's recommendation, including retiring and restructuring the residential RPT classifications. Any discussion? Absent objection. Oh,
I do have one point of discussion. I wanted to add, there is one drawback to the method, because we definitely simplified things with the way that we've modeled this so far, is that something would have to be done for the properties that are, for example, a $20 million property that I live nearby has 700 units. It's an apartment complex, and it has a single owner. That would put their property into that higher tier. But if it were divided into 700 separate units with as condo owners, then they would all end up being in the lowest two tiers. So there would need to be some method to adjust for single owners that operate, for example, an apartment complex, and have naturally affordable rates for renting out their units. Otherwise, a property tax change could really cause the rental rates to inflate with this method. So just wanted to make sure that that qualification is included in the recommendation, that is one thing that has to be worked out in the methodology.
Thank you, Commissioner Pham. Commissioner White, you got that?
Yeah, and Chair, you could confirm, is your motion to adopt or to amend the subcommittee's recommendation?
To adopt, I guess, with the to adopt with the amendments proposed by Commissioner Pham.
To adopt with the caveat noted by Commissioner Pham regarding the high-end
Single owner.
Yeah, regarding a single owner with multiple units, but they rent out their units to long-term renters at affordable rates. Wouldn't want such a model to penalize.
So to confirm, Chair Wong, your motion is in opposite to what you previously discussed. You're making a motion that's not necessarily your position, but you're making a motion to adopt the subcommittee's recommendation.
Yes, because it seems that I am in the minority here, but I don't want to hold up everybody else.
Okay. Second.
Second by Commissioner Peters.
All right, those in, I will note my objection to the motion, although it has been proposed, but for the purposes of moving this forward, because we do have business work to do, I will say that with nearly unanimous consent, the motion is approved and so ordered.
Okay, I'll make note reservations for Chair Wong then.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Aye with reservations on your motion. Chair Wong,
Yes.
is that okay?
That's acceptable.
Okay. Motion carries, and then it can be further discussed and worked through tomorrow.
Thank you. At this time, I really apologize, but I have to go. I wasn't expecting this meeting to carry on for 3 hours. I was wondering if folks were opposed to continuing these matters till tomorrow's meeting and adjourning. I really apologize, but I can't. I can't stay much longer.
No, not a problem, Chair Wong. If I can briefly, just looking at the agenda, the interim report was posted. Further discussion and whatnot can occur tomorrow regarding that as we have it agendized. So as far as agenda item 4, the interim report, any further comments or whatnot, feel free to email me and we will continue that tomorrow. There need not be any decision regarding, the last item, the only item that we need action on is agenda item 4, the follow-up comments regarding the interim report that you all submitted in December 2021. So is the commission, or Chair, if you want, is the commission all right with discussing that further as it's already articulated in the final report draft? Basically just reiterating the commission's position as it articulated in testimony to the Budget Commission or the Budget Committee?
That's appropriate. I think that my comments on this today were going to be relatively short, but I was going to recommend the interim report be incorporated into the final report so as not to bifurcate our findings. I think that City Council will be better served by having one report to look at instead of having to print out 2 PDFs. So that was to be my only real recommendation here. I was going to have some other discussion on transparency issues, but I think I'd like to just bring those up tomorrow.
Okay. So we can address any additional comments related to the interim report and how you want it addressed in the final report tomorrow. The discussion items on agenda item 5, there are 4 technical discussion items. One was if I could just briefly, for the record, highlight the subcommittees, sorry, I don't have it right here in front of me. The policy subcommittees report regarding renewable energies. All commissioners should have received that. The recommendation of this policy subcommittee, as noted in the document, if I may just briefly summarize for the policy subcommittee, it recognizes the passage of Bill 39 CD1, which was signed into law as Ordinance 2132. Various parties understood Ordinance 2132 was a temporary solution and that there was a need for further collaboration to provide clarity and certainty for existing property owners. The policy committee submits that the commission believes that this should include provisions ensuring that real property with renewable energy facilities upon it are able to maintain existing RPT classifications as agriculture instead of industrial, or alternatively to create a new RPT class and rate for property with renewable energy facilities upon it to remedy any confusion. The policy subcommittee's recommendation that they ask to be included in the final report is essentially a recommendation for the council to convene a stakeholder process or engage in some type of a stakeholder process to design and advise on legislation to succeed or amend Ordinance 2132, as that was originally intended to be just a temporary fix, and that the council should convene some type of stakeholder process to provide for a longer term solution and to provide for a broader consensus and agreement amongst all interested parties. That's the statement of the policy subcommittee. There's no need for action. It's just, but action is agendized on this for tomorrow. But it is necessary that it be this at least addressed during today's meeting, which has just been done and was provided in writing to the commissioners as well.
Understood, and thank you for that, Commissioner White.
And lastly, Chair Wong, regarding the other items regarding up for discussion on the agenda, item 2 was just a notation or reference to the prior audit report number 1302 and follow-up audit 19-07 of the Real Property Assessment Division. Those audits discuss historical properties as well as efficiencies and transparency and functionality of the RPAD. So those are just put on for discussion as they are somewhat referenced in the final report that will be reviewed tomorrow. Discussion item 3, we've been doing this whole meeting and I will be revising the draft and providing that to you all. Ideally, I think I should be able to have it to you first thing tomorrow morning. That's likely the best. I'll get you a revised draft, ideally by like 8 a.m. and our meeting is at 2 p.m. For further discussion. And then if there's any further matters, those matters can be addressed at tomorrow's meeting at 2 o'clock.
Thank you, Commissioner White.
Mr. White, the link tomorrow is the same as today, or different?
No, separate link, and I will send it to you all again. But I did send it. The link is included in an email that I sent last week Friday. But I'll send it to you with a follow up as far as the link and the password and whatnot. And I'll keep you, Commissioner Legal, on my little text message here, and I'll text you with any updates so that you can jump on if you're able to.
Okay, that'd be great. If you can also send me the link, that would be great. Yeah. Thank you.
Understood.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. I think we've settled everything that we had on the agenda for discussion. It's either been discussed or continued for tomorrow. Look forward to seeing you all there. To the members of the public, thank you for attending. Thank you for your time. If you're still there, there being no further business today, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
To move. One last question, Mr. White. The meeting tomorrow will be at the council chamber?
Yes.
Okay. Just in case. I'll be in town, that's why. Just in case I'll just swing by or something, whatever happens, you know.
Okay, so a motion by Commissioner Legal to adjourn. Commissioner Peters for a second.
Second.
Okay.
There being no objections, this meeting is hereby adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Wong.
Thank you.
How have you enjoyed the journey?
I
Fascinating.
learned a lot. I think back to that first day, it was kind of overwhelming. You come there and they hand you this binder and